Okay, let's unpack this. We've been staring at a stack of notes on the House of Lords that, uh, frankly, gave me a bit of pause.
Mm.
Usually, when we talk about Lord's reform, we fall into one of two camps, right? Either burn the whole thing down because it's undemocratic, or
Or keep it exactly as it is because of, tradition.
exactly. But the source material we're looking at today just throws a wrench in that whole binary. It asks a question that feels almost, well, existential for the British Constitution.
It's a clean sheet kind of question, isn't it? It
Yeah.
forces you to just ignore the history for a second and look at the actual mechanics.
Right. And the central premise is this. If we take the responsibility for ethical reasoning,
The big, heavy stuff.
the big, heavy moral debates, if we take that away from the House of Lords and give that job a home of its own, is there anything left for the Lords to actually do?
The fear of the empty shell.
That's it. My initial reaction when I read the abstract was, well, if you take away the moral arguments, aren't you just left with a room full of people in robes proofreading typos? If they aren't the ones standing up and saying, this is wrong or this is unjust, then, why do we have a second chamber at all?
Yeah.
But the source material corrects that assumption pretty aggressively.
It does. And that is really the mission of this deep dive. We aren't talking about abolition. We're talking about fixing a massive identity crisis.
An identity crisis.
Yeah. The core argument in the notes is that the House of Lords has become a moral backstop entirely by accident. It just wasn't designed to be the conscience of the nation.
So it just drifted into that role.
It drifted into it because, arguably, nobody else was doing it. And the text argues that this accidental job is actually breaking the machine. It's making the Lords worse at the thing it was actually built to do.
I want to dig into that accidental part because it feels like the Lords has been the House of Ethics for as long as I can remember. You see the bishops, the former judges.
It's grand speeches about rights, yeah.
You're saying this is a bug, not a feature?
Historically, yes, it's a bug.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least it's a symptom of decay somewhere else. Think about it. As the House of Commons has become more hyper-partisan, more about the whip, the soundbite, the 24-hour news cycle, there was just less room for that kind of nuanced ethical debate there.
So that pressure had to go somewhere.
It flowed up the river to the Lords. But the problem, as the source points out, is that we now talk around the Lords rather than at it. We treat it as this weird constitutional catch-all.
So it's the junk drawer of British politics. We don't know where to put this ethical debate about assisted dying, so...
So throw it in the Lords.
Yeah.
A very expensive gold leaf junk drawer, yes.
Okay.
And right now the source argues the Lord's trying to do two jobs that fundamentally conflict. Job A is technical scrutiny, making sure the laws actually work. Job B is being the moral guardian. And when you mix those two, you get a mess.
Let's break that conflict down, because on the surface, they don't seem mutually exclusive. Why can't you check the grammar of a bill and also worry about its soul?
You can, but it dilutes your political capital. Think about it. The Lords is unelected. That is its original sin in a modern democracy.
Right.
Every time they challenge the government, they are spending a limited amount of goodwill. If they spend all of that goodwill fighting a high-profile moral battle, say, about asylum policy or protest rights, they're exhausted.
They've got no capital left.
They have no capital left to fight the boring technical battles where the legislation is actually, mechanically broken.
So by trying to be the priest, they're failing to be the editor.
That's the analogy.
Yeah.
And the proposal in the source is radical.
Yeah.
Separate them. Move the ethical conscience role to a dedicated body, maybe a citizens' assembly, maybe something else, but get it out of the legislative chamber.
And the insight there is?
The insight is that removing that moral pressure doesn't weaken the Lords. It sharpens it.
Sharpens implies it becomes a more effective tool. But a tool for what? If we strip away all the high drama, what is the Lords actually doing on a Tuesday afternoon? The source calls it unglamorous but vital work, which is usually code for unbelievably boring.
It is boring, but it's the kind of boring that stops the country from grinding to a halt. We need to talk about the mechanics of legislation, specifically things like statutory instruments and Henry VIII powers.
Okay, hold on. You can't just drop Henry VIII powers and keep moving. That sounds like they're trying to behead someone.
Well, not quite, but it's nearly as dangerous constitutionally. A Henry VIII power is a clause in a bill that allows a government minister to change the law later on their own without going back to Parliament.
It's a blank check.
It is a blank check.
So the Commons passes a bill that says, we're fixing the environment, and in the fine print it says, and the minister can rewrite these rules whenever they want.
Precisely. We are seeing more and more of these skeleton bills,
Uh-huh.
bills that are just a framework with all the details to be filled in later by ministers.
And this is where the Lord's unglamorous work comes in.
This is where it's critical. The source highlights that their job is to read line by line and say, "Excuse me, minister, this clause gives you the power to rewrite the definition of a crime without a vote. We're cutting that out."
That's not a moral argument. That's a structural one.
Exactly. It's not, "This is evil." It's, "This is legally unstable and gives the executive too much power." It's the difference between an architect and a structural engineer.
Go on.
The architect, the Commons, sells the vision. We're building a beautiful glass tower. The structural engineer, the Lords, looks at the blueprints and says, "If you build it this way, the wind shear will shatter the glass on the third floor. Fix the math."
But here's my skepticism. Doesn't that just reduce the Lords to a technical advisory board? If I'm a voter, I kind of want a check on power that has some teeth. A structural engineer can be fired. A second chamber is supposed to say no. Can they still say no if they're just arguing about math?
The source argues they can say no more effectively. This brings us to what it calls the legitimacy trap.
The legitimacy trap.
This is the core reason why the current setup fails. When the Lords tries to block something big right now, what is the immediate counterattack from the government?
You're unelected elites. Who voted for you?
Right. Why should a bishop or a retired general tell the British people what is right and wrong? And honestly, it's a valid attack.
It is.
In a democracy, moral values should come from the voters. So when the Lords frames an objection as a moral one, they walk right into that trap. The government can just dismiss them as out-of-touch obstacles to the will of the people.
It neutralizes the criticism. The government doesn't have to answer the argument. They just attack the messenger.
Exactly. But now imagine the Lords stops talking about morality.
Okay.
Imagine they stay strictly in their lane of technical constitutional scrutiny.
Okay.
They say, "We aren't blocking this because we disagree with your policy. We are blocking this because Clause 4 contradicts existing data protection law, and Clause 6 is unimplementable by the police force as currently funded."
That is much harder to dismiss with a "who voted for you" slogan.
Makes the will of the people argument irrelevant. You can't vote away a logical contradiction.
Right.
You can't vote for a math error to be correct. By sticking to expertise, the Lords creates a position that is much, much harder for the Commons to just bulldoze.
So they become a council of experts rather than a rival priesthood.
That's the idea.
I see the logic. It lowers the temperature, but it increases the friction on the details. But let's play this out. Let's do a bit of a war game here. Because the House of Commons is supreme.
Yes.
They can override the Lords. That's the rule.
It is. The Parliament Acts allow the Commons to force legislation through eventually.
So under this new system, let's say the Commons wants to pass a digital surveillance bill.
Right.
It's popular with voters because it promises safety, but it's a technical nightmare.
Okay, so in the new system, you'd have your separate ethical body, that Citizens Assembly, maybe issue a report saying this violates privacy rights.
Yeah.
That's the moral flag.
And then the Lords, the technical body, issues its own report.
Right, saying the encryption backdoor you're asking for is mathematically impossible and it breaks banking security.
Oh.
Now, the Minister for the Interior looks at both reports. In the current system, the minister would just say, "The Lords are being soft on crime, push it through."
But in this new system,
The narrative changes. The source calls this the override narrative. If the minister pushes the button now, they are just ignoring the Lords. They are actively overruling a specific technical finding.
they're what, signing off on the risk?
They are signing a document that says, "I see the warning that this breaks banking security, and I am doing it anyway."
It creates a paper trail of negligence.
It forces honesty about the trade-offs. The source says it makes the choice visible. Currently, bad laws often get passed because the flaws are hidden under a blanket of moral shouting. If you strip away the shouting, the flaws are sitting right there on the table. If the Commons wants to proceed, they have to look those flaws in the eye and own them.
That's a subtle but powerful shift. It stops being "the Lords blocked us" and starts being "we decided the risk was worth it." It puts the responsibility back on the elected officials, where it belongs.
Which is terrifying for them.
That's exactly where I was going. This sounds great on paper, a cleaner, sharper, more honest system. But let's do the reality check.
Okay?
Why on earth would any prime minister agree to this? You're basically asking them to install a smarter, harder to dismiss alarm system in their own house.
And you've hit on the central paradox of Lord's reform. The executive branch generally likes a weak lords.
Of
They like a
course.
lords they can disparage as old buffers in robes.
Hmm.
A sharp, technical, expert chamber that points out every single flaw in their legislation. That is a prime minister's nightmare.
The source mentions this explicitly, right? It says this is a design solution to a power problem.
It is. And the source acknowledges that this doesn't fix everything. It doesn't solve the appointment issue. Who picks these technical experts?
Right. If the prime minister picks them, they'll just pick experts who agree with them.
Exactly.
You just get a chamber of yes men structural engineers. Yes, minister, that glass tower looks perfectly safe while the thing is wobbling.
Exactly. So you still need an independent appointments commission. You still have the debate about term limits. Should these experts be there for 15 years? For life? The source doesn't pretend to have the magic answer for the personnel.
But it does argue that by fixing the purpose, the job description, the personnel questions get easier to answer.
Yes, because right now, the debate is an ideological fight. Should we have elected lords? Is really a proxy war for how much power should the people have. But if the question changes to what is the best way to design a committee of legislative scrubbers, well, that lowers the stakes. It stops being a culture war and starts being a recruitment drive.
You're moving the conversation from democracy versus elitism to competence versus incompetence.
And it is much harder for a politician to argue against competence. It's hard to stand at a podium and say, we don't want experts checking our work. I mean, they do say it, but it looks bad.
It's a fascinating pivot. You're essentially trying to bore the system into working better, taking the heat out to let the light in.
That's a lovely way to put it.
But we have to leave the listener with the stress test. The source ends on a pretty provocative note. We've built this shiny new machine in our minds. A separated ethical body and a technical scrutiny body. What happens when it meets the real world?
The source asks the next uncomfortable question. How does this new body get captured?
Walk us through that nightmare scenario.
Well, imagine we have this pure technical lords. No politics, just scrutiny. The danger is that it becomes a technocracy.
A technocracy.
It becomes a place where expert opinion is used to stifle legitimate political change. You could have a situation where the Lord says, oh, you can't nationalize the railways, not because it's wrong, but because technically it's too difficult.
So it's too complicated becomes the new no.
Exactly. Weaponized complexity.
Hmm.
If you fill a room with lawyers and economists, they will find 1,000 reasons why any change is risky. You risk creating a chamber that is paralyzed by its own cleverness.
And then the government just learns to ignore them quietly. Not with a shout, but with a shrug. Thanks for the report. Into the bin it goes.
And because there's no moral drama, no bishops on the news condemning the government, the public might not even notice the report went into the bin.
So the boringness that protects it.
Could also be the thing that allows it to be sidelined completely.
That is the risk. When you lower the volume, you might just get muted.
It's the trade-off. Do you want a loud, messy, illegitimate chamber that sometimes stops the government? Or a quiet, competent, legitimate chamber that might get ignored?
That is the question to chew on. We started this deep dive asking if stripping the ethics out of the lords leaves an empty shell. And we found out it actually leaves a sharper tool, but a tool that requires a very steady hand to use.
And a government brave enough to let itself be corrected.
Which might be the rarest resource of all. Thanks for diving in with us. It's a dense topic, but hopefully, next time you see the red benches on TV, you won't just see a pageant. You'll see a machine that's desperately trying to figure out what it's for.
Always check the blueprints.
We'll see you on the next deep dive. Stay curious.